Shalom from Jerusalem. My name is Emmanuel Miller. I work as a writer-researcher for Honest Reporting, a watchdog organisation that aims to restore trust in the media at a time when many are concerned by misinformation and bias. Now, my organisation relates specifically to coverage of Israel, but some of the points I'm going to raise today should be of interest to anybody and anybody who's interested in the media. The points can be applicable to a wide range of media reporting, so you can really take this in a general sense as well as the specific sense I'm going to raise today. I'd like to thank our host for having me today, and you, my audience, for giving me your time. Thank you. So on to the next slide. Who are the media? The first point I want to raise is, well, there is obviously the media, and we can talk about the mainstream media. I prefer to talk about the journalists and the organizations that comprise the media, because ultimately they are responsible for the words that they publish and broadcast, and we should be holding them responsible. Now, if you look at the individual parts, you can see that there are some who are pro-Israel. There is a group of people and organizations that are anti-Israel, and that can come from different directions. It can be from the right or from the left, although typically from the left. We can see that the majority aren't necessarily pro or anti-Israel. Even those that might have a disagreement, you might say, with Israel's policies won't necessarily be overtly anti-Israel, but they will be either ignorant or they'll just be neutral. And yet, nevertheless, many of these organizations and journalists are quite capable, and they've proven themselves capable of producing reports that are anti-Israel, or they even push the BDS agenda. Now, how can that be? So as we all know, the journalism of today is not the journalism of the 1950s and 60s, when journalists would write a story and they would have multiple different sources. Nowadays, there is a shorter news cycle with the advent of the internet, and journalists feel a lot of pressure to get out stories very quickly. There are deadlines, they have to meet them, and so when a journalist who is based overseas, for example in Oslo or in London or in New York or wherever it might be, is being told by an editor, okay, you have to go and create a filler item, 400, 500, 700 words, they'll look around and they'll see what they can produce. And one of the phenomenon that takes place is, well, when you see other people writing about something, you say, okay, I can write about that as well. So it becomes an issue, and it becomes something that is known, that is, it's got its own corner of the website. There is a Middle East section. What do you think is going to appear in the Middle East section? Well, you see, the conflict, the Middle East conflict. Never mind, there is a whole Middle East. There is the Middle East conflict, which is, of course, about Israel. And so you see that these stories keep on appearing. And then there is another aspect, and this is somewhat more deliberate, and this is a concerted campaign. You see that there are organizations, NGOs, that have understood how journalism works, and they produce reports and they produce press releases which they send to masses of journalists. And they know that if they include some statistics, and if they include a quote, and if they include a claim that sounds serious, that will get media coverage, and it works. So I'm just going to look at the Honest Reporting website now. Here's a story I wrote on February 25th, so just last month. The British media published a story, very uncritically, that was founded on a really terrible investigation. When I say investigation, it's not worthy of the word, but the investigation was funded by there's a chain of groups here. So there is, at the base, there is the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. That is a terrorist group which funded an NGO called Al-Haq, which is a Palestinian NGO, radically anti-Israel. It supports BDS and it pushes the BDS narrative. And Al-Haq paid Forensic Architecture, which is a research group based in London, funded by an Israeli who used to work for B'Tselem. B'Tselem is another anti-Israel group, very critical of Israel. And all of this comes together with a study that investigated how Israeli troops responded when a Palestinian man rammed his car into them, veered into them at speed at a checkpoint, and they opened fire on him and killed him. And the response of the Israeli troops was absolutely fine. They thought their lives were at risk, and so they opened fire to protect themselves. But this report calls their response an execution. And not only did the British media run with it, and it defamed the Israeli troops, and also in numerous reports the funding wasn't noted. So it didn't mention that Al-Haq, and certainly didn't mention that the PFLP was behind this study. So that's a case of a deliberate campaign by anti-Israel NGOs to get into the media. You also have the socialization of the journalists, and this is an interesting point. You have journalists who hang out together. They are new to Jerusalem and they want to get to know the area, so they see people who work in other organizations, or they hang out in the evenings together for social events. And who else is there? Often it's not just journalists, it's other international types. So you have workers from the UN and workers of NGOs, and by hanging out together, their views coalesce and they merge, and they inform one another of their plans and of what they're doing. And so it's not a conspiracy against Israel, but it is a socialization. There's a process there in which the views of one impact the views of another. Now we should move over to the next slide. So bias can enter the conversation in a number of different ways, and one of those is boilerplate paragraphs. These are passages of text that are copied from article to article, and they explain a specific phenomenon. So for example, a very common example is the settlements. You might have a development in which a Jew is attacked by a Palestinian terrorist in the settlements, or you might find that homes are being built by the Israeli government in a settlement. And so then a few paragraphs down, after the initial description of the event, you will find a passage that is copy-pasted, and it describes the settlements as illegal under international law, and sometimes it will say they are an obstacle to peace. They are considered as such by the Palestinians or by the EU or the Biden administration, and you will find that is copied endlessly, and that impacts the public consciousness. Now, you will not find any such description of the BDS campaign as a racist campaign, and it's interesting to note when these paragraphs are included and when they are not. So with the BDS campaign, we know all too well that the BDS campaign targets the entire population of Israel. It does not target the policies of Israel, but anybody who is Israeli and exporting abroad, they are liable to be targeted by BDS, no matter their opinion, no matter their policy. We also know that Jews in Europe and in America, if they want to buy kosher food, much of the kosher food that they buy comes from Israel. That is where the largest Jewish community in the world lives. And unfortunately, repeatedly we have found that when Jews go to buy kosher products, they are met outside by pickets and they are met outside by protests. Sometimes we even find people going inside of these stores and asking Jews uncomfortable and annoying questions. And so we know that the BDS campaign isn't just about Israel and its policies, but it's about its very existence and the existence of those Jews that dare to support Israel at all. And really, journalists should be noting this, and they do not. So, and in this way, the BDS campaign is allowed to say that it is targeting Israeli policies, but that is clearly not the truth of the matter. On to the next slide. The BDS campaign penetrate the media through opinion articles. Now, it is great that there is a range of opinion in our news. We want to be confronted with opinions that we do not agree with. That is important for our conversation. But what is not okay is when those opinions tell lies, and that happens, or when there is an imbalance in the coverage. So when you have many articles criticizing Israel, but very few that criticize the Palestinian policies, or in fact when you have articles that call for the end of the state of Israel. And of course, people don't talk about destroying the state of Israel through violence, but they'll frame it in the language of human rights. So if we move on to the next slide, we know that there are over 120 territorial disputes over the world, but in only one is one of the parties facing calls for it being dismantled. And so we have people who work for BDS organizations, and in fact even intellectuals who are calling for a one-state solution. And so we find repeatedly in the pages of the New York Times, one of the leading websites in the world, which is read by millions, we'll repeatedly find calls for the end of Israel. And in fact, one of the people who has called for a one-state solution and dismantling the Jewish state is a man by the name of Peter Beinart. And just in the last year, he was appointed to be a contributing editor at the New York Times. So not only is his opinion expressed, he has now been given a position of power. On to the next slide. This brings me on to my last point. Over the last year, honest reporting has invested in big data, because while it is clear that individual journalists can and should be held responsible for their words, a big picture does emerge, and we know that Israel is scrutinized excessively in the media. And one of the blind spots is that, well, classical anti-Semitism is easy to identify. If somebody says Jews have horns, we all know that is anti-Semitic. But it is much harder to spot and for the media to write about more modern forms of anti-Semitism. So, for example, big data has revealed that while a congresswoman in America by the name of Marjorie Taylor Greene supported a bizarre anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, and the conspiracy theory came to light a few months ago, and there was much media coverage of her tweeting out Jewish space lasers. She claimed there were Jewish lasers out in space that were somehow doing something horrific. Forget the details, the fact is that the media did report about it, because it was clearly crazy and clearly anti-Semitic, and there were 106 articles per day throughout the relevant news cycle. There were, however, only 6 articles per day throughout the news cycle of another story about Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who participated in a recent event in which several known supporters of jihad were also part of the event. Now that is really problematic, and yet that received far less coverage in the media. So big data reveals that the media still are catching up with the reality that anti-Semitism has multiple forms, and some of those forms are from the left and some of those forms are against the state of Israel. And that lack of balance helps the BDS narrative, and it allows people to go and portray anti-Semitism as coming just from the right, whereas in reality it comes from the right and the left, and it allows people to go and espouse anti-Semitic views, calling for the dismantling of Israel without the media even noting it. And the big picture, after all, is wave after wave of anti-Israel coverage, and that feeds the BDS machine. That is about all that we have time for today, but I hope that you now look at the media in a more analytical way. You consider what is not just being said, but also what is not being said, what is being covered, and how it is being covered. For more information about Israel and about the Jewish people, you can check out the Honest Reporting website, honestreporting.com, and if you click through, I don't know how this will be provided to you, but I hope that you can check out our free ebook about the Arab-Israeli conflict for more information specifically about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Thank you very much for your time today, and enjoy the rest of this conference.